With that collapse, we entered a very shameful period of regression within the field. Alcoholics and addicts were transferred to rural penal colonies and work farms that became attachments to county jails. They were transferred to the back wards of what were already aging state psychiatric asylums. And a very important note with that was the concept that addiction was a disorder in and of itself was destroyed, and with that came this belief that if addiction was simply a symptom of underlying psychopathology, then what that meant was that the treatment of addiction in insane asylums in this country would simply apply indiscriminately whatever was in vogue in psychiatry over the coming decades. And that would include periods of mandatory sterilization of alcoholics and addicts, particularly female addicts and alcoholics. It would include indiscriminate application of electro and chemoconvulsive therapies. It would include psychosurgery, particularly prefrontal lobotomies, as a treatment for addiction. It would include drug insults of every variety and extremely prolonged periods of sequestration. We also saw in the cities the emergence of foul wards and foul cells in the urban hospitals to deal with the issue of the chronic public inebriate, including the Boston City Hospital. We also began to see, again, these invasive treatments move from the specialty sector of psychiatry into the larger medical communities. These are images. I want to give you a little bit of a feel for what it was like for me to enter the field in 1969 and see the very tail end of what the world looked like before there was specialized addiction treatment in the United States. This is the alcoholism ward at Peoria State Hospital, where I was a volunteer in 1987 and 1988. What I can't convey to you is the despair, and what I can't convey to you is the smell of this place. Between the urine and feces and formaldehyde, you could smell this place within about 150 yards of approaching the building. These are the shackles that were moved by a very progressive psychiatrist, George Zeller, from the detoxification cells within Peoria State Hospital. This is an addict at Lexington in the 1930s receiving electroconvulsive therapy as an experiment to see if ECT would speed up the withdrawal process. This takes us to the rebirth, the beginnings that are going to rekindle the years that are going to lead to the rise of modern addiction treatment and recovery support as we know it. This is going to begin with the emergence of what many of us as historians have christened the modern alcoholism movement, including the birth of Alcoholics Anonymous in 1935. It's going to include the development of the Yale School of Alcohol Studies. The Research Council on Problems of Alcohol are going to come together and basically promote a new scientific understanding of alcoholism. And the Fellowship of Alcoholics Anonymous is going to begin to rebirth public perception of hope for long-term recovery from alcoholism. For that movement to eventually rebirth a treatment system required replicable treatment models. And those models are going to come in the 1940s through the outpatient Yale clinics that are going to incorporate the use of lay therapists. These are recovering alcoholics, trained to be therapists and supervised by other therapists who will work within these outpatient clinics. We're going to see the extension of AA into AA wards in local hospitals in communities like Akron and New York and Philadelphia, and an AA ward in the Washingtonian Hospital here in Boston. We're going to begin to see the rise of a Minnesota model at Hazleton and Pioneer House and Wilmer State Hospital in the state of Minnesota in the late 1940s and the 1950s. And we're going to see that model taken to Chicago in an institution called Lutheran General Hospital that's going to set the stage for the mass replication of 28-day rehab programs throughout the United States in the 1980s. We also, on the drug addiction side, particularly narcotic addiction side, we're going to see three things. One is the emergence of therapeutic communities, beginning with Synanon in 1958, and the rapid growth of second-generation therapeutic communities. Synanon is itself going to go on and become an extremely closed, incestuous system and eventually implode, but will be enormously important in the sense that Synanon graduates are going to come to New York and start Daytop Village. And Daytop is going to go to Chicago and start Gateway and Phoenix and Reality and on and on and on. And that's going to exert an enormous influence on residential treatment during this time period. We're also going to get two pioneering physicians, Dr. Marie Neiswander, a psychiatrist, Dr. Vincent Dole, an endocrinologist, who are going to develop a metabolic theory of narcotic addiction and begin to pioneer the use of methadone as a maintenance agent in the treatment of chronic opioid addiction. We're also in the 60s going to see rising polydrug abuse, and we're going to see behind that the emergence of everything from things we then called acid rescue and community crisis clinics and street outreach programs, but most importantly, a modality called outpatient drug-free treatment that's going to pull in every imaginable psychological theory of addiction and spin that off into therapeutic interventions, mostly with young polydrug-using individuals and their families. The advocacy movement that's going to begin in the 1940s, and I really want to emphasize, we would not exist as a field today if there weren't, for the most part, recovering people and their families who spent the 1940s, 1950s, and 1960s, most of their adult lives, lobbying to radically change how this country perceived alcoholism and drug dependence. Marty Mann on the left spent almost her entire life basically trying to rewire this country's attitudes, and she did that very successfully and brought that advocacy movement into the early 1970s. And with Harold Hughes on the right, pioneered legislation that will create NIAAA and NIDA and begin this federal, state, local partnership that has really been the foundation of modern addiction treatment for these decades. So in the subsequent years since, which I'm condensing into a couple of sentences, we went from less than 500 programs in the 1960s when I first began to have contact with this field, to more than what is today, a report that I just read this week, we are now at more than 15,000 specialty sector addiction treatment programs. And let me just say euphemistically, this has been an amazing run for us. If somebody would have told me in those stench-filled backwards of Peoria State Hospital, Bill, don't despair because in your lifetime, you will see prominent people from all walks of life step forward and announce their status of being in recovery from alcoholism and drug dependence. They would have said, don't worry, you're going to see 15,000 addiction treatment programs in the United States before you die. You're going to see early intervention programs in the workplace and in the schools. You're going to see primary prevention programs throughout the country. Bill, you're going to see more than 100,000 people in recovery marching in the streets of the United States as people in recovery, publicly. I would have thought they'd been smoking the funny weed because that would have been beyond my comprehension. And yet we have lived this incredible miracle of the past decades.